Hey guys, it's Kevin, my review for the first season of the latest new show from Netflix, of course being Jupiter's Legacy. So what Jupiter's Legacy is essentially about is basically we center on this generation of superheroes, specifically the character of Sheldon Sampson, who he basically was one of the first official superheroes. He's created this thing called the Union of Justice, and since then they've had these like very, strict codes and ideals that they very much stick by, and so years later he is following now his kids and trying to see if they can live up to his legacy, which we see might not be the case when Sheldon's son Brandon actually ends up breaking a very cardinal rude sin of the code. Meanwhile, we flash back to 1929 during the stock market crash and really get to see how these heroes came to be and how they eventually turned into the first real superheroes to ever walk the planet. So Jupiter's Legacy overall, I was really looking forward to this show. I feel like recently we've, especially in terms of streaming, we've had some really good adult content in terms of superheroes, and similar to things like, say, Invincible and The Boys, I didn't know a lot about this property. This was something that was virtually unknown to me, but knowing that it was a new superhero show and it was coming on Netflix and it was actually created by the someone who did Daredevil, no less, I really thought this show could have been something special. I was really pulling for it, and let's get the elephant out of the room. There's been a lot of less than stellar reviews for this show. A lot of people have been coming out there saying that this is a horrible show and things like that, and look, I will say right now, is this a great show? No, but I can't lie, I don't dislike this show. I actually do think this is a pretty decent first season. No, it's not quite as good as what I wanted it to be, but it definitely is a very interesting season of television. It opens up some new ideas, and overall, I do recommend this show. I just don't think it reaches the heights of, say, certain shows like, say, Invincible or The Boys. This is not really on that level at all. Even Doom Patrol, a show I've really been enjoying. I haven't finished it up yet, but I've really been enjoying what I've seen of it. This does not hit the highs of that, but there still is a lot, I think, to like about this show, so we are just getting into it right now. So the one thing I will definitely say when it comes to this show that I think really does work for it is the cast. I think everyone does a really great job here in terms of acting. Let's first talk about Josh Duhamel, because I'm not gonna lie, going into this, I was a little bit worried. It's not so much the fact that I wasn't sure if he was going to fit this role. It's just I don't really see Duhamel as this amazing actor. I've never really been that impressed by him. He's given some good performances before, like his smaller role in Love, Simon and things like that, but he never really struck me as a leading man, and so I didn't really know how this show was going to turn out, but he crushed it here, I thought. He was fantastic in this show. He does a really good job playing this character, Sheldon, who he's someone that sticks very closely to his morals, and you can tell that he does. They mean a lot to him, and you can see how much he cares about that, but you can also see this is someone that has, that he now feels a bit conflicted. He's not entirely sure if he wants to abandon those morals altogether, but he is someone that's very noble, and he's sort of doing some self-reflecting throughout this entire show, and the way they tap into, like, his morality and things like that, I think Duhamel did a really good job with. And then in contrast to who Sheldon used to be, I think he does a really great job with. So I think he carries this entire show very well. He was a consistent standout for me throughout this entire show, and I think regardless of how you feel about this show, you can't deny Duhamel is actually really good in this role, and I myself was very surprised by just how good he was here. Someone else who really impressed me throughout the show is Ben Daniels, who plays the character of Walter. I thought he was fantastic here. He is very different from his brother. He's a little bit more pragmatic in the way that he goes about things, and he seems to be a lot calmer than Sheldon. He's not as worried. He's kind of like someone that Sheldon can always go to. But he, throughout the show, really does change as a character, and I thought he did a really good job with it. I don't want to spoil anything that happens with him, but the more they deepened his layers as a character, the better of a performance Daniels was really giving here, and I just really liked what he ended up doing in the show. Leslie Bibb was fantastic here. She's not in the show as much as I would have liked her to, but she does a great job, I think, as the character of Grace, someone who... Yes, obviously she is Sheldon's wife, but she's not someone who's just gonna stick by. She's someone who's very outspoken in that way, and I really did like her in this show. I thought she did a really good job. Someone who was a huge standout for me, though, throughout this entire show is Matt Lanter, who plays the character of George, and he was just so great in this show. Now, he's mostly only in flashbacks. We do get a few glimpses of him in the present day, but he's mostly just in flashbacks, and when he's here, he's fantastic. He has so much charisma. He's so likable in this role. The more that he shows up, the more I really did start to like him. He's someone that I think you're just going to naturally gravitate towards, but he also is probably the nicest character in this entire show. He really is just trying to be the best possible friend that he can to Sheldon, who's going through a very difficult time within his life, and so he really tries to rely on him, but you also see that he clashes, and so I think he definitely did do a really good job with that. Like I said, I think that he was just such a fun presence throughout this entire show, and I really liked what he ended up doing. The two performances that I will say I'm a bit conflicted with, first off is Andrew Horton, who plays Brandon. When he started off, I thought he actually was pretty good, but the more he went on, the more I just started to feel like he was very flat in this role. He's just not as, I think, layered as he needs to be. I think they needed a more seasoned actor for this role, and Horton is just not someone that impressed me all that much throughout this season, and I just didn't really think he did a great job. He was the one performance here that I do think just didn't really work for me overall. Elena Camporis, though, is really good as Chloe. She is the rebellious daughter of Grace and Sheldon. We'll get to her character a little bit more later, but I think overall she definitely did do a really good job here. Even some of the smaller roles in the show, like Tyler Main shows up a lot. He plays this character Black Star. Really intimidating presence throughout this entire show. I thought he did a really good job. I really enjoyed Ian Quellen as this character Hutch that we followed throughout the show. I thought he was really good. Really, everyone in the show, I think everyone does a really solid job here. I think this is a really good cast overall, and they're definitely one of the best things, I think, about this show overall. Alright, so now let's get to the directing and the writing, because, I mean, I will definitely say, while I don't dislike this show, the directing in this show is definitely not the strongest, and it's not because of, specifically, it's a complete disaster. I wouldn't say the directing is a complete disaster. The problem is what Stephen S. DeKnight is trying to do throughout this entire show. He's just biting off a lot more than he can chew, because what you have to understand going into Jupiter's Legacy is two things. One is that this entire season is essentially a prologue, which I will get into more with the writing, but that we're also following two drastically different timelines throughout this entire show. And I wouldn't have a problem with that if the tones weren't so different. When we're in the present day, it basically just feels like a typical superhero show. Sometimes it fits in line with, say, something on the CW, and honestly, it's not as bad as some of those shows, but it definitely feels more like a typical superhero show. But then we also have these flashbacks that are throughout this entirety of this season, and those feel a lot more like a film noir or something that you would get in a period piece, and there's a very different tone when we're there. Things are just a lot more, I think when we're in the present day, things are very sort of just, again, generic and what you would expect. But when we're in the flashback, suddenly everyone's more emotional, everything's a lot more heightened in that way, and so I just don't think these two tones balance quite as well as they needed to. I think there need to be a bit more of a medium there, and I think that ultimately is some of what will annoy some people about this show, is that it's not just that we're following two different timelines, it's that they're also completely different tonally, and so I think that's something where DeKnight just didn't do a great job with that. But I do think he shows a lot of promise throughout the show. He has a very interesting vision for what he really does want to do. I just don't think it was fully well realized yet. I think if this show gets a second season, it absolutely can, but I don't think we're quite where I want to be yet in terms of directing. So that is the one thing that I will definitely say is a problem with the show. The writing. Let's get into it. I won't lie, there's a lot of things that I do like about the show, but it has to be said, the writing's a mess. It really is. The writing is a complete mess throughout this entire show, but it's not a total disaster. I don't think that it's a disaster because a lot of the writing that's going on here is stuff that I am very interested in. But like I said, at the top of this video, you have to go into this season knowing that this is not going to be a very satisfying season of television. In fact, it's not really a season. It's much more of a prologue, sort of setting up what's to come. And I don't hate that approach. I really don't. I just think that that's something that a lot of people aren't going to be aware of until literally the end of this season, and I think they could have done a better job kind of setting that up overall, because the way the show starts off in the present day, there's this really interesting conflict. You have this character Brandon, we're following him around a lot, we see that he has a lot to live up to, people see him as, you could be as good as your father, his father's looked at as like this god of sorts, and Brandon, clearly there's a lot of, again, there is a lot that is on his shoulders. He has a big responsibility in that way. So when he eventually decides to go against the code, which is very early on and ends up killing this character in the show, it really kind of starts this debate whether or not, they should go about this code and things like that. And so I was definitely hooked after that. I think they have a really good hook there because you see how strongly Sheldon sticks to this code. This is something that matters a lot to him. You get the sense that he, doesn't really know how to be a superhero without this code. So the idea that his own son is deliberately going against it, you can really see how that has an effect on him, and I really was interested from there to see where the show's going to go, and where they take it. They do take it somewhere, it just takes a while for anything to happen after that. So I think some people might feel a bit bored with what's going on, but because again, it really is just a lot of setup. There's a lot of conversations with Sheldon and him talking about the code, but then you also have and how much that matters to him, and there's a lot of repetitive scenes about that. But the Brandon character you actually don't see for a long time after that, which was weird. I was like, this is the character that basically started the main conflict in this show. Why are we not focusing on him that much? Well, again, it's really just because the show wants you to develop all of the other characters, and I really would not have a problem with that if the show didn't present it in such a messily handled way. And I think that is something that is just kind of frustrating when it comes to this show. Once you get interested in something, it kind of cuts to something else, and so I don't think they do a great job with that. But I do think these characters themselves are really interesting. Like I said, Sheldon, for example, I was very fascinated by him. The way that he feels so strongly about the code, the way that he wants to uphold it. He never wants to deviate from it at any point, and you can really see how that's starting to clash with other characters. But you also see that he's someone that feels a lot of guilt when Brandon goes against it. He feels like he did something wrong, and so I found that really interesting when it came to his character, and I think there's a lot of interesting ideas there. But then we have the character of Grace, who I really liked a lot, because what I love about Grace as a character is that she isn't just someone that's going to abide by what her husband is doing. No, she is going to voice her own opinion. She is willing to change things if she needs to, and you can see that this is starting to kind of threaten their marriage a bit, and I really liked getting to see that. I think when we dive deeper into her character, she becomes one of the best parts of this entire show, and I really liked what they ended up doing with Grace as a character, so I think she is really interesting. So those are two characters that right off the bat I was very fascinated by, and then like I said, Walter as well is one that is very intriguing, because you don't really know where he fits into all this. He seems like he is, this really good brother to Sheldon. There's a really good scene in episode 1 where these two are kind of talking out, how because they were superheroes, people expected them to be involved in some of the nation's like biggest conflicts, and yet they couldn't step in, like say the Holocaust or say Vietnam War. Why couldn't they try to stop these things? And I thought that was a really interesting debate, because I've seen a lot of people bring this up when it comes to superheroes, like, why does this need to happen? Why does this event need to happen? Because again, it's not their place to get involved, and that's one of the things that very much did have me hooked into this show. So again, I think for everything that doesn't work, there's always something interesting going on, and that's one of the things that did overall keep me hooked into this. But again, that's not the only thing we're dealing with in terms of the present day, because there's also, like I said, a abundance of flashbacks throughout this entire show. And at first, when these flashbacks were going on, my initial thought was, oh, these flashbacks just don't fit in, don't really fit in here, and you should just have a whole separate episode of them because they're taking up too much of the show. But as they started to go on and they started to get more interesting, I said, no, actually, there's enough flashbacks for an entire season of television. I think the ultimate problem here is that these two timelines do not coexist in the way that the show thinks they do. It's very clear to me that they did this with the intention of trying to blend what was going on in the present day with the flashbacks, but that doesn't really happen a lot. The flashbacks, like I said, are really interesting. It's sort of like an origin story, getting to see Sheldon and him having to suffer through the stock market crash of 1929 and sort of what he was going through. Again, it's a really interesting story, but it's completely separate from what's going on in the present day. And so I think they just need to do a better job of connecting these two stories together, because very often it does kind of feel like you're watching two different shows. And like I said, for me, that's not as big of an issue as I think it will be for other people, because of the fact that I ultimately did enjoy both timelines and I enjoyed both stories that were going on here. But I just didn't feel it connected quite as well as it needed to. I've seen a lot of comparisons to Arrow and the flashbacks that they used to do, and I do think that's a pretty apt comparison, although I will say the flashbacks in the show are a hell of a lot better than the ones we've gotten in Arrow, and they're a lot longer as well. Like, they take up a bulk of the episode most of the time, and so I think that's definitely something that they overall did do a good job with when it came to the flashbacks here. They're still very interesting, like I said. The character of George as well is a huge standout throughout these flashbacks, and I like getting to see, what really happened to these characters, what got them to this place. I think it is a fascinating concept to see when it comes to these characters. The problem is, and I think the thing that does hurt the flashbacks, is that there really isn't that much there really isn't that much of a sense of unpredictability, because we ultimately do know what's going to happen to some of these characters. We know that Sheldon and Grace and Walter and pretty much all the characters we're following are going to eventually turn into these superheroes, and it's just a matter of, like, when is that going to happen? And so it does sometimes feel like we're just kind of waiting for that to happen, but there is still a lot of interesting stuff going on there, and I think they ultimately did a pretty good job with that. Like I said, this show does have a lot to say about living up to your legacy, but also the guilt that you feel as a superhero, and how that can really sort of like nag at you and things like that. And I think all that stuff is very well handled for sure. So that's stuff that I really did enjoy when it came to both storylines overall. And the other thing that I really did latch onto is the idea of the code. Yes, it is said a lot. I know it's sort of turned into a meme of sorts when the show was coming out. People were saying, like, take a drink, however many times they say the code, because yes, they do bring it up a lot, but just the idea that they have to live by it their entire life, especially Sheldon, who sticks so strictly by it. It's a very fascinating idea, how can you uphold this code? How can you make sure that you are abiding by it? Is it really, a good enough system? Is it even necessary to continue it? I found all of that to be very interesting, and I think that is one of the best parts of this show overall, is just the lore of everything, the code as a whole, how we really get into the ethics of it. Is it really something that at this point in the world, is it still something that they should follow? Is it even necessary to do? Or is it just a dated rule that maybe they should try to change? I think it's a really interesting idea, and I like that debate overall. So that was something that definitely did keep me hooked in throughout this entire show. That being said, both of these stories are not perfect in any way. There are definitely some things that very much do bring this show down. When it comes to the present day, the larger issue, aside from the fact that throughout a lot of the season, you really don't know where this is going, if it's really going anywhere, you also have this other character, Chloe, that we're focusing on. And like I said, Elena Camporis is really good in the role, but the Chloe character, I had a really hard time latching onto. I like the idea that she essentially is the daughter of Grace and Sheldon, but she's turned against them because she doesn't feel they were good parents to her. She didn't like the superhero life. She kind of wants out of it. The problem is, throughout a good majority of the season, you're just kind of watching her self-destruct, and she's indulging in a lot of drugs, a lot of alcohol. She is very rude to pretty much everyone around her, and I just didn't find this character to be very likable. It felt like it took a while for her to really get interesting for me. But the problem is, I feel like we had a lot of time to sort of dive deeper into her character, and we really don't for a while. Eventually, though, she did get better for me. Once she becomes more in line with this character, Hutch, who I'll get to in a little bit, I started to like her more. I started to like more of where she was going in the second half of the season, and where she ends things off, I'm very intrigued to see what they're going to do with her. But like I said, she was just someone that really dragged things out whenever she came on, and I just could not really get into her character. And like I said, the Brandon character as well, he starts off and he's one of like the main focuses of the show. He doesn't really come back until episode 5. We see him in episodes 1 pretty prominently, and then he's in a couple scenes in episode 2, but we don't really see him again until the 5th episode, and there's 2 whole episodes that pass by where we're not really seeing him on this show, and I just found that to be really weird because it feels like he should be a lot more involved. And so because of that, I didn't care as much about his character. I feel like they didn't do as great of a job of getting us to latch onto him. I found other characters like Sheldon and Grace and Walter and George like far more interesting than him, and so ultimately this character just didn't really work for me. And also, like I said, the structure of this season I think is really weird overall. The first 2 episodes, like I said, it takes a very sort of streamlined approach. You think you know where it's going to go. And then episode 3, suddenly the show starts to go in a far more individual direction. We're focusing on this character throughout the 3rd episode. I have no idea who he is. I don't know what his purpose is. It's not revealed until the end of the episode who he actually is and like why we're focusing so much on him. But because of that, again, I had a hard time focusing on that episode. I had a hard time caring about what was going on. So the structure of the show is just a little bit strange. I think the second half of the season is definitely a lot better than the first half. Once you get to episode 5, I think that's really when things start to kick into gear. But there definitely was that sense for a while of like, where is this really going? What is the point of all of this? And And so I think that's something that did ultimately bring things down for me. And then, like I said, on the flashback side of things, it's again that we know a lot of what's going on, so the flashbacks do turn out very predictable. And also, there's a lot of characters in the flashbacks that we see in the present day, and they're far more interesting in the flashbacks. The character of Fitz is a perfect example, who Mike Wade is really good on this show, but he has really nothing to do in the present day. He's bound to a wheelchair, and the thing is, whenever we see him in the flashbacks, it's all about how does he end up in that wheelchair. That's all we really care about when it comes to that character, but you see him in the flashbacks and he's a lot more interesting, and so you want to know more about him. So I think there's pros and cons when it comes to having those flashbacks throughout the season. There's more pros overall, but I do think there are some things that do ultimately weigh the season down, so I think that definitely does bring things down for me. But I will definitely say, I think this is definitely one of those shows where if you are not into it at first, you should definitely stick with it until literally the end of this season, because once you get to those last 2 episodes, it becomes apparent where things are going. It becomes apparent that there actually is a purpose here. There actually is some sort of, this show is going to deliver in some way, and I think they did a pretty good job with that. I just worry that for some people, they might have waited a little bit too long. For me, like I said, I was willing to sit it out. I was willing to see where the show was going, and I was overall satisfied with where they ended up going, and it made me intrigued to see where else the show can go, beyond this season. But I do think for some, that definitely will become a problem. So that definitely is something that I do think brings the show down. Again, the writing is kind of all over the place here. There's a lot of things that work. There's some things that don't. And I think that's probably going to be the make it or break it thing for a lot of people. Let's talk about the cinematography, because I will get the elephant out of the room. The costumes are not very good. Yeah, they're really not very good here. I get it that they were trying to be comics accurate, but a lot of these costumes, when you see them, they just look a little goofy. I think the Utopian especially, again, the character of Sheldon is really good. It is someone that I really did enjoy watching throughout this season. I found him to be a very compelling character, but his suit is just really silly looking. It looks almost like something that you'd see someone wear at Comic-Con than an actual superhero wear, and so it just can sometimes take me out of what they were really doing, but I think the look of the show is very interesting. The flashbacks are significantly darker, and, they have this sort of like darker hue around them to sort of make them look vintage, and that's something I really did appreciate when it came to the flashbacks. You feel like you're in that time period of the 30s, and they do a really good job with that. And then in the present day, things are just a bit more colorful, and I think that does ultimately work really well. So I do like the look of this show. There aren't that many action sequences, though. That's the other thing. If you're expecting a lot of superhero fights, there aren't a lot. There's a really good one in the first episode that kind of hooked me into the show initially, but there isn't a lot throughout the season. But when they're there, they're pretty good. I do think that they do a pretty good job when it comes to the cinematography on the show, so that's something that was definitely a big highlight. And the score as well, I really do enjoy. I will say the intro to the show is extremely boring, and one that I always found the need to skip. I don't think it's a very good intro at all, but I did enjoy the score that Stephanie Economo did for this show. I thought it was a pretty good score overall. The editing, let's talk about it. It's not so much just the pacing itself, because like I said, the way the show's constantly jumping around, it can feel very jumbled in that way. The larger issue I have is there's only 8 episodes throughout the season, and some of those episodes are only about 35 minutes long. Yeah, you heard me. 35 minutes for an 8-episode season is absolutely ridiculous. And so there's a lot of episodes that kind of feel like a waste. Episodes 3 and 4, I both think are kind of a waste because they're too short. And I think they could have taken more time to dive deeper into these characters if we just had a lot more time to do that. It's not a surprise to me that the best episode of the season is the longest episode of the show, because we're given that time to really fully dive into into everything. We're given a lot more time to understand where these characters are going, what this is really all leading to, and it's just a more satisfying, story overall. So I think if this show does get renewed, which I'm not sure if it's going to, based on the reviews, I'm really not certain that this show is going to get a season 2, but let's say that it does. I think something they really do need to improve upon is longer episodes, because the 35-minute episodes are just not going to cut it when it comes to this show. I think you needed a lot more. You needed a much longer runtime, and I think that does sort of bring down some of the episodes overall. But now I do want to get into some spoilers for Jupiter's Legacy. So if you guys have not seen this first season, I do overall recommend it. Like I said, it's definitely not going to be for everyone. Don't go into this thing, it's going to be The Boys. Don't go into this thing, it's going to be Invincible. It's very different in that way. And I think it's either you like it, it's either for you or it's not for you. And I think it's definitely one you should stick with until the end of the season. But again, I hope you do enjoy it. But anyway, let's just dive into spoilers here, because there is not a ton to talk about, because like I said, there's not a lot going on this season. We have very early on where Brandon ends up breaking the code, and we see that Sheldon himself is very conflicted with how to go about it, but he also is sticking very close to his morals. Like, no, this is the code that I created, and from there, we don't really know where it's going to go. But the interesting part of that to me is that Grace isn't really on his side here. At first, she is, but you can also see that throughout this show, she starts to realize there are instances where superheroes are going to have to kill. There are instances where they're going to have to go against that code. Even though she's stuck so strongly by it, she's starting to realize that it just might not work anymore. And I really like the direction that Grace ended up going in there. I thought that was one of the more compelling plot lines of the season. I was not expecting them to go in the direction they did with her, but I like where things are heading for Grace and Sheldon. I don't know if they're going to be able to survive this show together. I feel like something is going to end up breaking their marriage apart, but I think that definitely ended up being one of the more compelling storylines for sure. So I really did enjoy where they end up going with that, but of course, the big things we need to talk about. First of all, Chloe and Hutch. I did not realize how much I needed this dynamic, because it made Chloe such a better character overall. Hutch is someone that, she confides in. They, at first, are just having sex and things like that, but you can see that she very much does confide in him. She's someone that, he's someone that she does ultimately end up latching onto, and I do think they did a pretty good job with that, although I do think that their overall relationship felt pretty rushed, and I think they could have done a better job with that overall. But the bigger reveal, of course, is that Hutch is actually the father of George, and we spend a good majority of the season thinking that George went rogue and that he is now the villain, and that's why we're not really seeing him anymore. He's this character, Sky Fox, who, again, we only see every so often, and I think they do a really good job of initially tricking you. We get to see how good-natured George was and how he was someone that really stuck by Sheldon, but we also do see how he was very much clashing with Walter, and how these two just didn't really get along at all, because Walter wanted to be there for Sheldon, but George also wanted to be there for him, so you could see these two were never really on the same page. So again, you spend a large portion of the season thinking that he's the villain, he's the guy they gotta go after. Towards the end of the season, we realize that Hutch and Chloe are actually going to track down George, which I'm happy about, because I like the George character a lot. I want to see more of him. That's one of the reasons I really do need the show to come back. But of course, the bigger reason I need the show to come back is the way things do wrap up, where it turns out this entire time, Walter's actually been the one that's been pulling the strings. It's not George that's the villain. It's Walter that is. He is the one that essentially summoned Black Star. He's the one that created the clone and things like that, and basically he is the person that is responsible for every single thing that's been going on. He's been manipulating his brother, and it makes a lot of his previous motivations make a lot more sense, because before I was really wondering where they were going with Walter as a character, but now it makes a lot of sense. He was clearly jealous of his brother. He You can see in that penultimate episode that he has this moment where he talks about how his brother was always seen as the one that people idolized over. People saw him as like this amazing person, but Walter felt that he deserved that same treatment and he never really got it. And so you can see that there's a lot of jealousy between these two, and I really do like where they're heading with that character overall. And the fact that he literally kills his own daughter just to keep his secrets. I mean, you really do see how far he is willing to go, and that alone is enough a reason for me to want the show to continue. I really do want to see where they're headed with the Walter character. I feel there is so much potential for what they can do with him, and Ben Daniels being the villain, I mean, I should have known. It's Ben Daniels. Like, he's one of those actors where, like, you put him in a show like this, he probably is going to be an antagonistic figure, and I like that he ultimately was, because I do think it is overall the right direction for him. And where is this going to take Sheldon as a character, sort of showing his naivety in that way, the way that he is so close to his brother? You wonder what else his brother has been sort of using against him, and I feel like ultimately he's going to try to pull Grace away from Sheldon. I think that's one of his main things, because you can already see that Grace is feeling very close to Walter in that way. They seem to sort of be on the same page, so I'm very interested to see where that's going to go. Brandon and Sheldon as well, it seems like there's sort of a divide between them as well, so again, I'm interested in seeing how they work things out. And then in terms of the flashbacks, big thing in the flashbacks that I chose to leave out of the review because they don't really tell you about it in the trailer is that Sheldon's father did, of course, commit suicide very early on the show due to the stock market crash. And you see throughout a lot of the season, Sheldon is feeling guilt over this. He's brooding a lot. I won't lie, sometimes that got a little tiring because it's like, I get it, you're really, hung up over this, but is there anything else that we can dive into? So when they set off on that quest sort of to take Sheldon's mind off of it, I was relieved because I thought that's really when things kicked into high gear when it came to the flashback. So actually, I think the introduction of George and him having a larger role in the show, that's when the flashbacks really started to get great for me. But especially when they set off on that quest and they're on that island and they're starting to turn against each other, I think that's when it got really good in terms of the flashbacks overall. I mean, we end this season and everyone now has their powers. They've created the code. They're now in the, they've now in the Union of Justice. So now it's going to be all about, where do they really go from here? How do they really get to experience these powers? How do they ultimately become these amazing gods and goddesses that everyone looks up to? How do they become these characters? I think is something that we're going, how do they become the characters that they are in the present day? I think that's something we're going to be exploring a lot more in the flashbacks, and I'm very excited to get into that overall. So like I said, there's a lot here that makes me really want the show to continue, and I do think the way the show wraps up overall is a satisfying enough ending. It made this season's sometimes sluggish pace worth it. It made sometimes me questioning what the point of this show really was overall worth it. I do think there's enough that the show sets up towards the end that turned me around on this season, that made me realize how much I was overall enjoying this, how invested I really was in things. I think those last two episodes are really great and they set up a lot of interesting ideas, and I just really hope the show is able to fully dive into it. I hope the show, again, this is just a prologue. I hope that this really was just the prologue and then we're able to kick things into high gear when we get to season 2. Again, it's just a matter if they're actually going to be able to make it. Overall, guys, Jupiter's Legacy is a very strange season of television. There's a lot of things I do like. You got a really great cast here. Josh Duhamel, Leslie Bibb, Matt Lanter, Ben Daniels. They all really do deliver in that way. A really stellar cast overall. There's some really interesting ideas about, the necessity of superheroes and should they get involved in real world conflicts and things like that, and seeing the contrast between how these characters are in the past and now how they are now. Is a very interesting thing to see. There are a lot of points throughout this show where you're not entirely sure where it's going to go. It sort of feels like it's dragging along. It is very much like a prologue in that way, but when we got to the end and we really do see what things are gearing up for, I think we're in for a really interesting show. I'm very interested in seeing where else this show is going to go. I think it's headed in a really in a very interesting direction, and that's something that definitely does captivate me for sure. Again, I really just hope this show is able to move forward. I hope we're able to get a season 2, and I also hope they're able to improve upon things if we do. Have more flashbacks, but give those flashbacks a little bit more of a purpose within the show. You can keep those around, maybe change some of the costumes a bit, give some of these characters a little bit more room to grow, expand some of the episodes, and I think overall this could end up being a really different and very refreshing superhero show that I did overall really enjoy. Like I said, I don't think the show is going to be for everyone, but when it comes down to it, this was a show that I was very conflicted throughout a lot of it, whether or not I was liking it, but considering how good those last few episodes were, I do think overall I can say I did enjoy the first season of Jupiter's Legacy. It's definitely messily handled. It's not the best, it's not the strongest first season of a show that I've seen. It's not The Boys, it's not Invincible. It really is kind of its own thing. And again, there are points where I wasn't sure how I was really feeling about it, but ultimately, I did really enjoy this one. I am going to give the first season of Jupiter's Legacy overall a B-. But over, guys, to my review of the first season of Jupiter's Legacy. Let me know what you guys saw this season overall, left your thoughts on it. We'll see you guys in my next video, and we'll see you guys for that. Okay, bye.